Geachte aanwezigen, geachte sprekers en gasten. Als jonge vrouw las ik eens het boek Orlando van Virginia Woolf. Hierin schreef ze: het leven kan wel 2 of 3 eeuwen lang hetzelfde blijven en dan plots in 1 nacht tijd veranderen in een nieuw tijdperk. 16 jaar geleden. 16 jaar. En meer dan 70 regionale, nationale, Europese verkiezingen geleden. Meer dan 70 avonden geleden waarop ik hoopte, bang was, jubelde, won en verloor, stond ik hier plots als vers verkozen Bundeskanzlerin. Lieve vrienden en vriendinnen, ik kan jullie niet genoeg bedanken voor het vertrouwen, jullie ideeën, de steun, de kritiek, de verbondenheid die ik de laatste 16 jaar van jullie gekregen heb. Ik dank jullie vanuit het diepste van mijn hart. Dank je wel. 16 jaar later, aan de vooravond van mijn afscheid, blik ik vooruit op de grote toekomstige uitdagingen. Zal onze maatschappij verder polariseren en zullen enkel radicale klanken enkel nog gehoor vinden? Zal er een verschuiving van de economische wereldmachten plaatsvinden? Veel regeringen halen ons nu al in. Krijgen we een totale afkeer van multilaterisme, in ruil voor een resolute terugkeer naar nationalisme? Hebben de laatste uren van onze Europese Unie geslagen? Of luidt de decennia lange ontkenning van de plastic bergen in onze zeeën überhaupt het einde van onze schepping in? In geen partijmotto dat ik ooit koos, had ik het over deze toekomst. En daar moesten velen aan wennen. Waar staat hier toekomst? Nergens. Waar staat hier Duitsland? Nergens. Waar staat hier iets over mensen? Over waarden? Over zekerheden? Nergens. Enkel dit. Zusache. Of dit. Zusammenführen und zusammenführen. Maar daarmee is toch alles gezegd. Want wat anders moesten we doen, wilde ik doen, dan samenbrengen en samen leiden. Voor en met ons land, Duitsland. Europa, ouderen en jongeren, oost en west. Sterkere en zwakkere, stad en platteland. Autochtone Duitsers en migranten. In tijden als deze en in tijden die komen. Ik wens ons allen toe dat we ook in moeilijke tijden, vol complexe opgaven en bezwaren van buitenaf, onze christelijk-democratische waarden bewaken en behouden. Nooit iemand uitsluiten of tegen een ander uitspelen, maar de mensheid als geheel dienen. Lieve vrienden en vriendinnen, ik sta in de tijd en het is tijd voor een nieuw hoofdstuk. We staan aan de vooravond van een nieuw begin. Een nieuw gezicht. Een nieuwe toekomst. Het is aan u. Dank u wel. Auf Wiedersehen. Tschüss.
Yes, good evening, and here we are. Welcome to the post-Merkel era. You saw Angela Merkel being played by Benjamin Moon. It was her farewell speech. And he's the actor who previously played Merkel in the Electra opera Merkel, both written and directed by Floor Houwing-Steenkate. She's sitting here.
I didn't write it entirely, it was written with everyone.
With everyone? Yeah. Okay, but it was your production. Weiter so. Those were the words often used by Angela Merkel, the first female Bundeskanzlerin, who's about to say farewell. Next Sunday, there'll be elections for the German federal parliament, the Bundestag. And one thing is for sure, after 16 years, soon Angela Merkel will no longer lead the federal government. Weiter so. Merkel is leaving, and all over the world, but I think mostly in Europe, people wonder how things will be without her. And that is not very likely going to be weiter so. Angela Merkel has become the symbol of Germany as a stabilizing power in the middle of Europe. It was under her reign that Germany could finally come to terms with its past. It became at ease with its size and power in the heart of Europe. It was her article of faith. She often said it, a strong Germany needs a strong Europe. And that is a united Europe. And Merkel was often willing to pay the unity's bill. While Merkel was the master of the compromise, around her politics changed. She became an appeasing power in an ever more polarizing world. The international scene also became much more conflicted. She lost Obama as her companion when Donald Trump took over the White House, and domestic politics changed as well. Merkel declared her policy alternativlos. Well, the rebound was Alternative für Deutschland. 4 years ago, AfD was the first far-right party after the war to win seats in the Bundestag. So next Sunday, the Germans will go to the ballot. They will determine who is succeeding Angela Merkel. Well, the three candidates: will it be the Christian Democrat Armin Laschet? Will it be the Social Democrat Olaf Scholz, or Green candidate Annalena Baerbock? Merkel's departure raises questions about Germany's future, about its stability, about its geopolitical power of the EU, of Germany, and about the solidarity among member states. And those are the questions that we will be discussing tonight. So welcome to the post-Merkel era, towards a more or less European solidarity. This program is a collaboration between the Balie and the European Council on Foreign Relations. We start at this table with Floor Houwing-Tekate. She's the director of the Electro Opera Merkel, that was made by 90s Productions and Orkater, and Laurens Boven, political journalist and former correspondent in Germany. Welcome to you too.
Thank you.
Well, let's have a look at Merkel as a political icon. Because Floor, you are in theater. We just saw the goodbye speech you wrote for Merkel. Especially for
I also did not write that entirely.
Well, anyway, you worked on it.
Yeah.
So you made this opera on Merkel. I was wondering, for a theatre maker, what is it that fascinates you in Merkel? As if you look at her, you would say she's not a very theatrical person. She seems a bit boring, if I may say.
Yeah, no, that was exactly the point. Merkel became Bundeskanzlerin when I was 17, so it was when I finished high school and, had a broader view on the world, I think, or I got a broader view on the world. But then she was quite like this grey mouse for quite some time. But then in 2015, with the refugee crisis, then suddenly for me she stepped out of the shade into the light of the world stage. And then I was already a theater maker. And then I thought we should make an opera for Merkel and about Merkel. It's because she's a great, like a big political icon. And also we made performances for younger people here. And then I thought it was important that they would also see performances about her being such a non-theatrical character.
But then, working with a non-theatrical character, what do you focus on? How do you try to catch that personality?
Well, the best thing about Merkel is the fact that she does not say many things about her own personal life or something. And also when it comes to her personal life, but also when it comes to what her political view on the world is. And that was really great for us theater makers, because then we get to decide who she is and what she thinks and what she dreams about. And we talked about Merkel as being a projection screen, actually, which makes her a nice politician because you can project everything on her. So that's when we decided to make an opera about the refugee crisis, and then about the 24 hours in which she hears that all the refugees are walking towards Germany, and then what does she do, and what does she think, and what does she dream about? She falls asleep, and then she has this big nightmare. And then so we decided to make for her, as this non-theatrical character, to make this hero's journey. So for an anti-hero, we made a hero's journey.
Very, very interesting. I'd love to see it. There's Annelien de Bruijs, you're sitting in the front row because you composed the music together with somebody else. But you worked on composing the music for that opera. In what way did Merkel inspire you?
Well, I think it's a little bit the same as what Floor says, that she has, she's a kind of a non-character. And for theater and for music composer or for a character in an opera, that's actually perfect, because you can go and flip all those big emotions onto this character where it actually slides off. And I think that was really interesting in this performance, because there's also a documentary of half an hour before where we talk about the opera, and also a documentary after with Putin and Merkel. And there you really feel what it means to kind of want something from a political figure. And I think the music for me tried to throw her onto the biggest pedestal there was, and that never happened.
Oh. Well, we'll see in the end, because you'll sing for us later. Laurens, you are a political journalist. You lived in Berlin, and you just this week you published, if you say published, you broadcast a podcast, Het Berlijn van Merkel, Merkel's Berlin. I assume you too are inspired or fascinated by her political personality. What incited you to make this podcast?
Well, I as well didn't make it all on my own, like you.
It's great that we share credit.
Yes, of course. No, I made it with a friend of mine, a colleague, Rob Zavelberg. He's a correspondent from the Telegraaf. And the funny thing is that he went to Berlin at the end of the 90s. I came a bit later, but in both our careers as a journalist there, Merkel was, of course, well, the chief, and he experienced her rise to power as a journalist, and his career and her career more or less coincided in developing. And since she's now leaving after such a long time in a historic situation, that for the first time since we can remember, a German chancellor steps down willingly. She's not defeated in an election. That's like never happened. Perhaps Adenauer stepped down. I don't know. I'm not sure whether he was defeated or stepped down. But she leaves office out of her own, and she doesn't is not defeated. So that I thought it was historically important to tell the story about Merkel and Berlin, especially also because she's more or less, perhaps I think, the last former East German politician that lived through dictatorship, lived through the liberation, the freedom, the end of dictatorship, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the German unification, and has this part of her biography combined with her political work. So it's not only that there's just a new chancellor in a couple of months, but it's also the closing of an era.
Of that era, of that chapter. What do you want people who listen to your podcast to learn? What is new, you think, to them?
Well, the funny thing is, as a journalist, I tend to be inspired by the place where a story happens. You know, the geographical surroundings of a parliament building, or of the place where people live, or the way the city looks or smells or feels. Because it's very important to realize in what surroundings people function in order to understand them better. And one of the podcast series has 4 parts, and every chapter we discuss a different aspect of her life. And so Merkel and the GDR.
Yeah. But what do you consider the most interesting thing that you tell in these 4 podcasts?
Well, in the part about the Merkel and the foreign policy, for instance, we discussed the whole situation of the foreign policy of Germany at the Brandenburger Gate. And there is, of course, the gate. And if you look at the direct surroundings of this place, you have the embassy of the United States, directly left of the Brandenburger Gate. On the opposite side is the French embassy. Then there's the British embassy around the corner, and the Russian embassy is a couple of 100 meters further down the street. So that's 4 of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council are present in the heart of the the German capital, directly next to the German parliament buildings. So politicians in Germany, they can't ignore the world powers when they're doing their job. Directly next to the American embassy is the Holocaust Memorial. You know, this impressive building site with all the concrete rocks, which is built on the foundations of the Hitler bunker, where Hitler killed himself. And what struck me especially was that in the grassland, the front yard of the Parliament building, the Reichstag, there is this Russian memorial site, the big Russian statue built in 1945. It's not only a statue, it's also a burial site. There are 2,500 Soviet soldiers buried more or less in the front garden of the Parliament building.
And what does that have to do with Merkel?
A lot, because it creates the atmosphere in which German politics is made. So the German basic principles of never again Auschwitz, never again war, a strong Germany only within a strong Europe. These principles of German politics, we don't understand them often in the Netherlands because we find them, we are a bit more lighthearted. Germans are a bit more serious in life. In order to understand this seriousness, in order to understand why this is so important for Merkel, you'll have to understand how Berlin, or it's nice to look at how Berlin is created and how it looks in the city center, what is there. And then you can understand why it's so important for her. She can't ignore all these facts.
Was also the protester still sitting in front of her office? I'm not sure whether you've seen it, but there was a man who came over as a refugee, but he had a sign in all different kinds of languages in which he said that his children and his wife are still in, I'm not sure where, I think it was Syria, but then he was sitting there across her, the Reichstag, like for a year or something when I was there. It was really impressive, I thought.
Floor, you decided to have Merkel played by a man. Why was that?
Yeah, it was because I've known Benjamin for quite some time, and we share the same political ideals, I think, or also in theater. We both like to make political operas, and then or like political performances. This was the first time we made an opera. And I thought that he actually looked like Merkel in a kind of way. So then I thought it was funny.
He does actually, yeah.
Yeah, well, not anymore, because when we were making the performance, he had long hair and we put the moustache off. But then, yeah. So no, but because we share the same views also on Merkel, and I thought it was nice also because Merkel always says that it doesn't matter that she's a woman. I totally disagree. But then I thought, well, then I can.
And it doesn't matter
to
have her played by a man.
Yeah. No, because it's still about her, and yeah, no, for me it doesn't matter. I think people will disagree, but yeah.
Okay, we'll end this this evening with listening to one piece of that opera for now. Thank you very much, Floor. Yeah, Merkel's political style and approach mostly stood out in times of crisis, and she had some. We had the euro crisis, the financial crisis, more recently the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course Floor mentioned the migration crisis. Luc van Middelaar is a political philosopher, historian and professor of EU law at Leiden University, but he lives in Brussels, I have to say. His new book, he wrote it, Een Europees Pandemonium, is dedicated to this pandemic and to its historical meaning and its geopolitical impact, a European pandemonium. Luc is going to read a little piece out of it for us. Luc, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Marcia. So the book, part of the book is a chronicle of the pandemic. That's the heart of the book. And the heart of that chronicle is when Merkel takes the stage. And that passage, I'll read in the English translation, which is soon out. It's called The German Chancellor's Leap. And it starts with a quote by her. In the long run, things can go well with Germany only if they go well with Europe. End of quote. In her 15 years in office, Angela Merkel often said something of this kind in the Bundestag, but never with more sincerity and conviction than in her first speech to Parliament after the start of the pandemic, on Thursday, the 23rd of April, 2020. To the German parliamentarians, spaced out at a suitable distance, several of them wearing face masks, she declared firmly at the opening, I quote, "This crisis presents all of us, government and parliament, our entire country, with its greatest challenge since the Second World War, since the founding years of the Federal Republic." End of quote. For that reason, she predicted, I quote, "The question of how we prevent the virus at some point overwhelming our health system and costing the lives of countless people as a result will for a long time be the central question for the politicians in Germany and Europe. Die zentrale Frage für die Politik in Deutschland und Europa." Now you have to know that the previous evening she had presided over a meeting of all members of the government coalition to consult on national measures. And several hours after that, she had taken part in yet another video summit of the European Council. The German and European perspectives were really interwoven in her speech. The Union is a Schicksalgemeinschaft, a community of destiny. And therefore, Merkel prepared her listeners in the Bundestag, Germany will, in the spirit of solidarity, have to provide the EU budget with, I quote, "a very different or clearly higher contribution. A solid recovery fund would be needed to steer all the member states through the pandemic." Now, this spring, that was the moment when the Union creaked and groaned, and Angela Merkel knew the podium was calling. The first shock had been brought under control by mid-April, but the pandemic was a threat to Europe's unity and solidarity. And from various sides, the federal chancellor felt forces demanding action.
Yes, Luc, please take a seat. Let me introduce somebody else in the meantime. Jana Puljarin, she's head of the Berlin office of the European Council on Foreign Affairs, the ECFR. Her area of expertise includes Germany's role in Europe and in transatlantic relations. She also directs ECFR's project called Reshape Global Europe. Jana, please join us at the table. Yeah, look, in the book you describe the crisis as a historic moment. Do you feel COVID will turn out a transformative crisis if it comes to Europe's positioning between the US and China? Because you write a lot about that.
Yes, I think the COVID crisis was truly a moment when Europeans for the first time realized how vulnerable we are.
Not on our own.
Our own bodies,
Yeah.
Very vulnerable, and we didn't think that something like a contagious disease like that could happen in Europe. We thought this could happen only in Asia or Africa, but also more widely our strategic or geopolitical vulnerability. And of course, people have talked about the rise of China for quite some time among experts and diplomats. You could see this big tanker coming on the horizon, but in the pandemic, China, which was the first to deliver mouth masks and medical help to Italy, after Italy had called for help desperately, Italians in northern Italy were gasping for breath, basically. No single European country responded, at least not immediately. We can come to that later. But China then offloaded with the Chinese Red Cross a whole plane full of stuff in Rome to make a political point, choosing the capital and not in Milan, where they also have very nice airports, and which is much closer to the pandemic, but they landed in Rome. So there we felt, vis-à-vis China, this vulnerability. And at the same time, when we looked at the United States, which has been the power protecting Europeans ever since 1945, and which is also for Germany, obviously, so vitally, existentially important, the US was nowhere to be seen. It was
denying the crisis.
Denying the crisis, President advising even his American citizens to use bleach more to be stronger against the virus. And remember, many Americans ended up in the hospital after that. So we felt a bit alone. So it was a moment of solitude. And I think that will stay with us because it was also a traumatic moment.
Interesting. Well, let's turn back to Merkel, because in the past 16 years, Jana, how did Merkel change foreign policy during her reign?
So So on the European level, Merkel always was the crisis manager, and I think she grew into that role also on the international level, although I think many of our friends and allies accused Germany for a long time for not doing enough on the international arena. Like, I don't know if you remember 2014, the 3 speeches at the Munich Security Conference when our back then president, the defense minister and the foreign minister all gave these speeches that kind of Germany needed to show more international responsibility, needed to become more active, more visible on the international scene, because when it came to international crisis management, Merkel wasn't all that present, or Germany wasn't all that present.
But this was after the financial crisis then.
Yeah, but I think...
Where she had been very decisive, no?
At the financial crisis, yes. Some say she was more divisive than uniting Europe over the financial crisis, but I think the kind of the first really big moment on the international scene she had during the Ukraine crisis, the management of the Ukraine crisis, when Germany, for the first time, I think, after reunification, really took the lead in managing a foreign policy crisis. I mean, together with the French, of course, but in the Normandy format with Russia and Ukraine, the United States weren't on board, but the kind of Merkel and Obama back then closely coordinated the approach, and Merkel was really the driving force in bringing the Europeans together, uniting them against Russia, kind of making sure that the sanctions were in place and frequently rolled over. And yeah, I think you can give Merkel credit for many things, but I think her international legacy, I mean, with the exception of the management of the Ukraine crisis, but I mean, she always says she isn't the leader of the free world, and I think when it
you
comes...
agree?
Yeah, actually I agree. When it comes to international relations and leadership, I think we haven't seen enough coming out of Germany in the past 16 years.
Laurens, the image of Merkel is different from this, from what Diana is telling us, because she's always seen as the international crisis manager, leader of the free world. How
she's seen as a moral leader, which was, of course, in the refugee crisis very visible, no? With the Weerschaffendas, so the opening of the borders.
But not in the financial crisis?
The financial crisis is, of course, it's not a very clear point, because in Southern Europe, she was pictured with a Hitler moustache in an SS uniform. So they didn't see her as a pro-European idealist in Greece. People lost their homes, their houses, their lives, their jobs, everything, because of cutbacks that were made on orders from Germany.
Yeah, but wasn't Germany the architect by that time of the restructuring programs for the South?
This shows how important the chancellor is for the rest of the world. And it's maybe also why we're having this debate in Amsterdam, even talking about Merkel. Jana was saying before our conversation, well, this is very surprising. But for us, Germany, Merkel or the chancellor is Germany. So for the Greeks suffering from austerity, Merkel was Germany. But in the financial crisis, she also had to unite not just Europe, but she had to bring, in my view, the reluctant German electorate who didn't want to help Greece and the others on board of rescue mechanisms. So she had to keep the unity of Europe in that way.
I see in the financial crisis, as well as the refugee crisis, the basic principles of the foreign policy of Germany. The no strong German without a strong Europe. You can see that it was there. This point about she had to save the euro. In order to save the euro, Greece had to stay a euro member, because when the euro fails, Europe fails. And in order to make this possible, we needed these cutbacks. That was the ideology of the IMF in the economic terms. So you can say it's an idealistic approach, but real life effects in Southern Europe were quite different.
And also, what I find fascinating is that I think for her and for Germany, this was a very delicate and tricky episode. Huh? The moustache Laurens is mentioning. But in a way, the decision she has taken in the pandemic, and which I was referring to, and what is this book also in part about, is also a result of all these experiences of not only the migration crisis, but also the euro crisis. And in the pandemic, Merkel felt earlier than any other German politician, let alone Dutch politician, if I may say so, that she had to act, that she had to move, and that she could not afford Germany to be the Scrooge of this story in this crisis, which was a public health crisis, a crisis on life and death. And that in this crisis, there was nobody to blame. The virus hit every single European, whether in Sweden or Greece, the same way. So all the stories which were being told in Germany at the time about Greek spendthrift or the Italians do not reform enough, and we can nuance all that, but of course there was also an element there. And in this crisis, it was different. So she knew we can not only do the discipline, paying rhetoric, we need the language of solidarity.
We need to be generous.
For the first time, she made that move, but as I said, also as a result of the memories of the euro crisis, which were coming to the surface in the south.
Also, I mean, very practically, because during the Eurozone crisis, the EU was on the brink of collapsing, north and south, and I think she wanted to avoid this at all costs. So, and that wasn't in the very beginning. I don't know if you remember the vivid debate about the Corona bonds before all this idea with the recovery fund came up, when basically the EU was again at this point when the South clearly signaled this is not acceptable. And then she changed basically. Of course, afterwards, because it was not, I think she really had a tough lesson to learn in the Eurozone crisis, that she could not, that a lot of other Europeans felt that they were living under basically a German dictatorship in the South.
You could say that, you could say that when the Germans changed their minds in the Corona crisis, that they forgot to call the Dutch finance minister before.
Yeah, you could say that the Dutch underestimated the impact of all the previous crises and the resentment still of 10 years ago vis-à-vis Germany, but also vis-à-vis the Netherlands. There was a previous Dutch finance minister, Dijsselbloem, who ran the Eurogroup, who was one of the bogeymans of the crisis alongside Schäuble. And so she was more sensitive, and the German political class as a whole, to the suffering of Southern Europe than some other Nordic countries.
Can you fully compare these crises as in the euro crisis, of course, there was a lack of policy, and there was not foreseen in having enough reserves. Whereas this crisis was like a more democratic crisis. It hit everybody in the same way. There was nothing you could do about it. So maybe it was easier for her, with respect to domestic policies, to be generous.
And let's not forget, she sold this as a one-off, as a historical exception in kind of exceptional circumstances. That doesn't mean in any way that the CDU or she herself bought into this Hamiltonian moment narrative that came
what was the historic novelty?
She said it's a pandemic, we are all in this together, and for once we need to allow the EU to take on joint debt. But this is an exception. This is not the new norm, and that's how she sold it to the German population and also to her party first and foremost. And if you look at the election campaign now,
what would you have wanted her to do? To say we're going to do this 25 more times? I think the important thing to do in a situation like that is to have it one single decision at that historic moment. And as you know, Merkel, whatever her prudence, but she's always very aware of the dynamism of the situation, the changeability of the situation. And she just needed this one single decision. And I don't think she really cares. But that I don't know, but because, like Floor, we don't really know her. But I don't think she really cares whether there will be a second Corona fund if in 10 years' time we have another pandemic. That's not her problem. Her problem was right there. And that she solved. And it will probably happen more often in the future that things like that will be decided.
But of course, she had to make sure that the southern European countries had been asking for Corona bonds for a long time, and she had to make sure this is like one single unique time in history. Jana, your ECFR conducted a broad research on the international perceptions on Germany and Merkel. I was curious To what extent did Germany's role in Europe change the way European countries look at Germany?
So I think the most important finding is really how popular Merkel is all over Europe and how much I think Europeans will miss her. We asked the hypothetical question, who would who people would elect as president of Europe.
Yeah, we have that on a sheet. Could we have it?
A post that doesn't exist. But we basically offered two candidates, Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel. And as you can see, Merkel is the clear winner, and including in France, by the way. So, and Macron is not at all popular. So with her kind of attitude of trying to forge compromise, keeping the club together, taking everybody on board, she was very successful. And another interesting finding, and that comes back to what we discussed previously, is that we asked also in which policy areas do Europeans trust Germany to lead in the European interest. And strongest support, or strongest trust is in economic and financial policy, closely followed by democracy and human rights.
And least?
Least is relationship with China and relationship with Russia. So whereas 1/3 of Europeans trust Germany to act in the European interest and to lead the EU when it comes to the economy and finance, only less than 1/5 of the Europeans that we asked said they trust Germany when it comes to China. But I think the economy and finance part is interesting because the strongest support came from the Netherlands and Spain alike, and Hungary, so a country not even in the Eurozone. And that brings me back to what was said previously about her as a projection screen. And so I think there is certainly some truth to it, but I think it's also really due to the recovery fund that I think if you would have asked people during the Eurozone crisis, we wouldn't have seen such a huge support. So I think that this also has changed the perception of Germany significantly.
Yeah, Laurens, it seems as if she's more popular outside Germany than within Germany.
Well, I don't know. I mean, she's not on the. She's not.
She's still the most popular politician.
Yeah, I think so.
In
yes.
Germany as well.
Germany, yeah.
If she would run, she would win again, I think. And it's not for coincidence that the candidate of the Social Democrats, he basically claims to be her natural successor, although he's from a different party. He has a very frech. How do you translate frech in English?
Smart or?
No, brutal. Beetje brutaal.
Yeah.
He copies her. He has even.
But
Merkel,
he copies her in what respect? Like being very.
No.
He wants to be her in a suit.
Merkel is in his campaign film. You see him, and then in the background you see Merkel. He was pictured like this.
No.
In the newspaper, in Süddeutsche Zeitung. So he says, if you elect me, nothing will change. And he's winning with that argument. I mean, that's incredible.
Because he seems to be more reliable than the Christian Democratic alternative, Armin Laschet, who seems to be less steady, less reliable, less experienced, flip-flopping during the COVID crisis. So the kind of the real Merkel is Scholz.
It's
and
with
not
SPD.
Laschet.
But
that also shows you the importance of her personality above her policies, basically, and the importance also for the voters of strong character, to the extent that people switch parties in terms of the reliability of the candidates.
But
listen, we will talk later about the candidates because I still have some. I have some more of this research of Jana. I wanted to have a look at that before, so we'll come back to that later. Because there's also another interesting question that put out the question: has Merkel made the world a safer place? Could we see that one, please?
Yeah, and I think here you see that more people think that the world has been safer with Merkel, but I think you also see a lot of people being indifferent about this. And again, I mean, I buy the narrative that she has been Europe's crisis manager in the Eurozone crisis, in the refugee crisis, and also during the COVID crisis to a certain extent, but on the international scene, like when you, for example, think of Libya, or when you think of Syria. I mean, of course, taking in the refugees, but kind of foreign policy-wise, or Germany was absent. And so I think there is a certain truth to this. I mean, she has been a stabilizing factor, but I think, as I said, on the when it comes to kind of international diplomacy, I think she could have done better.
I said earlier that I see the ending of the chancellorship of Merkel as an end of an era, where she's the last politician that lived through this division in Germany and the reunification. And in some sense, you could say, I think it was Heusken, her long-time foreign advisor during many years. He's now the head of the UN mission in New York for Germany. He said Germany is still at the brink, or still has to make the move from being the federal republic to being Germany. So a real country with a real mission and a real status in the world. There is still this German fear for being too big. And I think that the world in Europe desperately asks for German leadership, but the Germans still are a bit reluctant. And perhaps the next chancellor, that could be a change, that the next chancellor, because he will not have this personal biography, this personal relationship with the Russians, with dictatorship, has a different approach and could be more like a German leader.
Yeah. It is interesting, though, what Johanna was saying, that with respect to Russia, Luc, Merkel is not that much trusted on foreign policy sides, whereas that is her cultural background. In the eastern of Europe, she speaks Russian.
Well, it really depends, of course, who you ask. I think in Eastern Europe, her role of mediation in the Ukraine crisis, Jana referred to, together with President Hollande, was not received so well, because whenever the Germans and the Russians are talking, the Poles get scared, basically. I think more interestingly is also that, if I understood correctly, there was distrust about her relationship with China.
Even more so, yeah.
And even more, in fact, apparently. So, and there you feel, I wouldn't quite agree with Heusken that Germany did not have a foreign policy, but a critique you often hear, and there's some truth in it, is that Germany does not have a foreign policy, Germany has a commercial policy. So Germany and Merkel herself also played an important role, managed to secure its economic interests, including in relations with China, with Russia, but she went every year to China, almost, with big business delegations.
Yeah.
And sometimes to the extent of other priorities, be it in terms of values, or also in terms of a more active crisis managing role.
So this idea of Merkel being a moral leader, the idea we have, especially after Wir schaffen das, is maybe not so correct if you look at what drove her was mainly business interests.
Well, I think that would also be stretching it in the other direction. She is, in my view, a politician who has a real sense of all kinds of conflicting forces and political, economic, public opinion, as we just talked about, Southern Europe. And there she tries to be in the middle, always, politically, geographically. And she tries also to bridge where there exist differences between German and European positions. Even in the refugee crisis, you can discuss, yes, there was an element of charity, but there was also an element of calculation, which was about Germany's reputation, which was about the fear that there would be images in the media of German policemen hitting at Syrians at the borders, and it's okay if the Hungarians do so, or Turkey, because afterwards, as you know, we asked Turkey to do it.
Tax and police,
to be our border guard, but not Germans themselves.
Yeah.
So there was also a necessity there alongside the charity.
Yeah, and I think there's basically two sides to many of these stories. The Turkey deal with and the generosity to let the refugees come to Germany. But if you look at relationship with Russia, kind of Navalny was treated in a Berlin hospital, which was great, but at the same time, Nord Stream 2 was completed. When it came to China, she was meeting with the Dalai Lama, but then obviously was not so much caring about forced labor in China, or it did not kind of, she did not really speak up on this topic. So I think she has been very pragmatic and has always been looking at what is achievable. And I think, you can actually argue it both ways. You find examples for both, a very principled leader and sometimes also kind of interest first leader.
It's also morally brave or outspoken to meet with the Dalai Lama, because I think that Mark Rutte, our Prime Minister, never met the Dalai Lama, for example. So that is extraordinary.
Well, he was in the Dutch parliament. There are pictures hanging in the parliament of the Dalai Lama visiting the Dutch parliament.
Okay.
And she did not speak up when the demonstrations in Hong Kong happened, so she remained silent then. So,
yeah.
It has to do a lot of it is before it was non-character. That was described like the character of Merkel. That she's a non-character. She's a crisis manager, and she can change sides or opinion
Easily.
Yeah. Before she was elected the first time, she was a right-wing neoliberalist, and we have seen nothing of that agenda being pushed through in Germany. She was pro-nuclear power. She actually nullified the decision of the Green and the left-green, the red-green government of Schröder to stop nuclear power. And then Fukushima happened, and she changed her mind, and she said again, no, Germany will stop with nuclear power. Yeah. So.
Okay, but now it seems like you're criticizing her for being pragmatic. But isn't that also the reason why she was in office for 16 years?
And why she was so successful.
And why she was successful, because she adapted to the times.
Yeah, the only time that we really saw something of an inner Merkel, of the person, human being Merkel, was in the backlash of the refugee crisis, when she was criticized, and when the AfD and the right-wing extremists were violent in Germany. And she said, if we're not able to help people who are in need, then this is not my country anymore. That's what she said. And that was a very personal expression of her inner being, I think.
I also remember one time at the time of the Arab Springs, 2011. That's one of the times I heard her give a speech, and it was the most powerful one I've at least witnessed, because she identified with people longing for freedom and democracy for their country, as the Arab youth in those days could still hope for, because she also has lived through that in her youth.
Yeah, of course.
And she also knows and said this may take time. So this is also why I think voters respect her and have re-elected her 3 times, and maybe indeed they would have done a 4th time if she had stood for election.
Yeah,
because even with all this pragmatism, you can feel there is an inner person there.
You could say she has a lack of character, but she at the same time seems to be sincere, and that is always rewarded. But let's have a look at, there's another final slide I wanted to look at with you, Jana, about, there was this question to Europeans and to Germans. Do you think that after Merkel, Germany will become more nationalistic? What was the outcome?
So, I think the overall EU assessment is fairly balanced. Basically, 27% say that Germany will become more nationalistic, and 25% say it won't. So I think this is fairly balanced. But the Germans themselves think that they are committed pro-Europeans, and that they will be focusing on the EU level on helping other Europeans in the future. And I think that also shows how deeply ingrained kind of the EU is in our DNA, because the EU, I think for Germans, has played a very crucial role in basically helping us after the atrocities of the Second World War to feel kind of well in our own shoes, to feel comfortable with our own German identity being embedded in a European identity. And I think you still see that with many people.
The willingness to show solidarity.
Yeah, and also this commitment to the European level. Although we have polled in April, we have asked people kind of how they perceive the EU, and we have admittedly polled at the heights of the COVID crisis, but there we saw also some backlash in Germany, some people getting increasingly Eurosceptic or questioning kind of the functioning of the EU institutions. So I think it would be a mistake if the next German government would look at this and take kind of the German German people's buy-in for a
Granted.
committed pro-European integrationist policy for granted. I think that is definitely not the case.
Okay, let's have a look at the post-election scenarios, because next Sunday there's these elections. For CDU-CSU, it's not going to be easy elections. Huh? It's of course always very hard to fill the shoes of a leader that, while still being in office, is declared historic. Today, The Economist had this funny piece. It said, being the next German chancellor is like playing James Bond after Sean Connery.
That's a good one.
Yeah, I love that one.
Which one was it actually? Which one played James Bond?
Well, there you go.
We don't know.
Exactly, that's it, yeah. So first there was Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, and she was like the designated successor, but had to step down. Then followed a bizarre campaign, as you called it, Luc. Armin Laschet was launched, but his campaign was far from convincing. So I thought, let's have a look at the polls right now. Here's a poll from Politico. Yeah, since the beginning of the campaign, the polls changed very dramatically and strangely. How did you explain for that, Luc? Because first, the Green candidate started very good, Annalena Baerbock.
Yeah, so she embodied basically the desire for renewal.
Mm-hmm.
For the electorate, also, I think, in tune with a longing for climate policies.
Yeah.
But also, if I may say so a little bit more cynically, the press like to see new faces. And I know there's two members of the press at this table, but there's also a media dynamic which clearly played out with Annalena Baerbock. So she was catapulted as New Germany, and then also shot down 3 weeks later by the same journalist who at first hailed her. So she came down. You see that very nicely at the graph. Between April, she moves up, and then May, and then boom. And then she made, she had not been tested enough, I think, in her own party before.
So she's too light.
She was too light, and they were very proud. I thought it was funny, but the Greens were very proud. Well, we have no rows, and we have a very orderly procedure, and we have her as candidate. But in fact, it meant that she hadn't been tested, and she fell at the first obstacle.
Yeah, and then why did Laschet go down and Scholz come up?
So I think, Laschet had problems from the very beginning, because first it was very hard for him to win the leadership race for party chairman. He had Friedrich Merz as an alternative candidate who was very popular with especially the very conservative wing in the Christian Democratic Party. So he won that, but not kind of with overwhelmingly support. And then he had the next basically leadership battle against the Bavarian Minister President Markus Söder, who also wanted to be the candidate for Chancellor for the Union. So he had to basically defeat two very influential people first, and then his campaign took off. And I would say that whereas Merz, I think, rallied behind Laschet, Söder never really did. So the conservative camp in this, or the kind of the Union, was never really unified in this election campaign. And of course, then I think the breaking point for Laschet was really when he was caught laughing. Exactly. When there was these terrible German floods, and he was laughing.
You see it exactly at the graph there, mid-July. There, it's going downhill.
Yeah.
Well, the floods were in his home state, and
so
partly
in North Rhine-Westphalia.
Partly.
Of course.
Yeah.
Well, you see, can I say one thing about these polls? Because I left Germany as a correspondent 10 years ago, and since then something really dramatic changed in German politics. And since basically the financial crisis and then the refugee crisis, you have the AfD, and since then it's more and more hard for me to understand Germans. Because what happens with the AfD, it was impossible for like 7 or 8 years ago. As soon as a German politician would say something nice about German soldiers in the Second World War, he would be finished. He would be ignored and would be gone from the polls, or nobody would vote for him. And that's still happening. It's a right-wing extremist party, and they are still at 11%. And it's really fascinating because the CDU, CSU, they had always one of their basis ideologies was right of us, there won't be an alternative.
Nur die Wand.
Genau.
Yeah.
Das war die CSU in... und that changed.
Yeah, well, yeah.
It's more or less Germany is now a normal country. If you see it, the CDU CSU 22%. It's incredible. When Merkel came, the first election she got like 35%, and that was the worst result ever. And now they are at 22.
Yeah, and what is like the main topic determining these elections, Luc?
Well, I think it really turns around personality.
Yeah, I wanted to get away from personality,
but,
but you said there's nothing else.
Well,
So it's climate change, I would say.
Is it?
Yeah. In Germany, it's climate change these days. We have seen this today. I mean, I don't know if you followed the news, but there was a big protest today
Berlin, yeah.
in Berlin, and this overwhelming kind of number of people showed up to protest. This is what has been driving the debates. This was the kind of, I think, most discussed topic, followed by social justice. That was also a topic. But in general, Lucas.
Well, and then pensions and financial
Yes.
solidity.
No, but you're of course
we have
right.
a debate
It was
among
about persons.
the younger generation, which is a lot about climate, and I guess the older generation where it's more financial topics. But I mentioned personality because all these dynamics there, and in particular Scholz moving up, first Baerbock and then Laschet moving down, is about their weak performance, basically. Their weak theatrical performance as potential political leaders.
But Merkel's performance was never mind-blowing.
No, but she was solid. She was clear. She was good.
No mistakes.
No mistakes. No scandals. No stories. No sex. No money. Then you survive as a political leader. She was smart.
Yeah.
She knew. I mean, this I also know from the time I worked in Brussels for the European Council president when she attended the summits. She was the person in the room who knew best. I'm talking about the leaders sitting around the table. Huh?
Yeah.
Sarkozy at the time, we even had Berlusconi, Merkel. She knew what she put her signature on. She knew what she decided. Better sometimes than some leaders of countries who were involved. So that's also why she did make so few mistakes. She was meticulously prepared, very, very clever. And I think in terms of her communication, she improved, clearly, even if she's not a born storyteller, and she never will be. So, final look at this great slide. Thank you, Jana. I mean, 35%.
It's political.
It's political. Well, it's February, basically. When goes the CDU down? The moment when Laschet is designed within the CDU, because I think this was in January.
Yeah.
And then people start to realize, oh, she's actually leaving. And then the black line goes down.
Germany, just like Holland, is a coalition country, so a coalition will have to be made. Can we have a look at the possible coalitions based on this poll? Oh yeah, that was a great cartoon.
Oh, that was very fast.
Well, we will see it. We can see it. We can put it back. So looking at this, Jana, which coalition is now most realistic? It's like the Kenya?
No, but I think it's really too close to call. So what we've seen on the left is the poll of the polls, but there is a new poll, for example, out today, which shows only 1 percentage point difference between the CDU and the CSU. So I think this is really too close to call. It's by no means clear that the SPD will win this. What is, I think, certain is that both the SPD and the Union will not reach more than 30%, which is for the Union already a catastrophe. But what I think is that it will be very close, and that is not the best outcome, because then both Laschet and Scholz will try to form coalitions. And so it will be up to the FDP, the Liberals, the yellow part here, and the Greens to decide on the coalition. So the most likely coalition, if you asked me today, and I needed to bet, I don't know, 100 euros, I would say it's a traffic light coalition.
Which one is that?
Ampel.
So an Ampel, yeah. And followed by Jamaica. But I think Kenya and Deutschland, I think, is pretty much excluded, because I have not met one single SPD and CDU politician for the last, I don't know, year
Who want to go together.
want to go in one coalition. I mean, this is really, by now, a very complicated relationship. So I really don't see that if another coalition is possible. But the big problem is really it could take forever. So just imagine you have, I don't know, the CDU comes first by 2 percentage points, followed by the SPD. The CDU tries to form a Jamaica coalition, but the Greens want a traffic light coalition, but the Liberals want this.
You can join the Netherlands in having a formation of half a year.
We actually call this the Netherlandization of German politics. That's
we call it that we're like Belgium, huh? So it's the Belgianization of European politics.
You call it the normalization of Germany.
But let's say it becomes Ampel, so the SPD will be in the lead. What would that mean for Germany and for Europe, Luc? Let's look at Europe. What would the Ampel coalition, what would change?
In terms of policies, Germany is obviously very important and a decisive voice in many European matters. And with the red socialist, social democrat chancellor and the Greens in government, I think you would have a push for a greener climate policies at the European level.
Would it be different with Jamaica? Because there's also the Greens in it. If you have like CSU with
I guess it would be a little bit different, but that also depends, of course, who would then be in positions of power within the CDU, which is more divided over climate than the SPD, in my view. But also, I think one should nuance that there's a lot of continuity in positions of states, of member states of the EU, regardless of governments. I mean, of course, when you really zoom in, all these parties are different. But when it's about the big things, about what is the view of Germany on trade, or what is the view on industrial policy, there are certain givens and which have to do.
For Europe, it wouldn't change that much.
It wouldn't change that much, and basically, we're now really looking at the German election, but it doesn't matter that much.
But maybe
who wins? If I just may compare one half a sentence, if you look at the French elections, which come up in half a year from now, the French presidential elections, there, of course, whether you have Macron or Zemmour or Marine Le Pen, or that really makes a massive difference, a huge difference for how the EU would even function. Whereas in this case, whoever wins, seen from Brussels' perspective, you will have a pro-European leader of Germany with
but now
solid
you look at everyday. Now you look at everyday politics in Europe. How would it be different in case of another crisis?
No, there is a difference. My beauty of small differences here. I totally agree with Luc. So, but when it comes to, I think, the future of the Eurozone and the future of the Stability and Growth Pact, for example. And this brings me back to the recovery fund that we had just discussed, because the position of the Christian Democrats and the Liberals is that this is a one-off, and that we kind of, once this kind of crisis is over, which is pretty soon, we turn back the clock, and we go basically back to the conditionality. We reinforce the Stability and Growth Pact. We have conditionality. We have strong sanctions. And there is no such idea to continue the investment policy that had started under the COVID pandemic. Whereas Olaf Scholz clearly says he wants to transform the Stability and Growth Pact into a sustainability pact. He wants to continue the investment policy that was started. The Greens are very outspoken. They want to transform, or kind of make the recovery fund a permanent instrument. And of course, in a coalition that would be difficult, but I think here you would see different emphasis. And if Germany blinks in this policy area, I think this is decisive for many issues.
And I think the same. I think this is true, and I think the same will. You will see the same with the climate discussions. There's a big discussion in the European Union now for how to pay for the investments needed for the climate transition, and there's a talk of a European Social Climate Fund, where basically that's the name. And there's an ideological difference between how Social Democrats look at this and how Christian Democrats or Liberals look at this. I mean, the plan is written by Timmermans, who's from the Social Democratic Party, and you even see the difference here in the Netherlands concerning these kinds of investments. And so the question who's going to pay the bill, that will change. The discussion will change with the coalitions in Germany.
Yeah, and do you feel that the relation with like big international players like Russia, the US and China, will that change when Merkel is gone?
That will change. Because she embodies Germany and she speaks with the full authority not only of being the Chancellor of Germany, and that authority will be inherited by whoever comes next, but also with a strong personality,
authority,
her experience, 16 years in office, personal relations with Putin, with Xi Jinping, with others. And there are also policy differences when it comes to foreign policy, but let's not go into these details. I would like to come back to my favorite topic there, personality. Again, there it really matters who you can send to Vladimirovich Putin on behalf of not only Germany, but also in a way on behalf of Europe.
Yeah.
And, I guess judging from them as actors on stage, I would rather send Olaf Scholz than Armin Laschet as a personality, because he will be less easily blown away by the aforementioned leader in the Kremlin.
But on substance, they are very much alike. No,
I'm not talking about substance.
Yeah,
I know, and
they both support Nord Stream 2. The SPD is the party of the Ostpolitik. They never fell out of love with that concept. Armin Laschet has also expressed mutual times that we need to talk to Russia. I think both would be more open to Macron's ideas for reboosting the relationship with Russia and for some sort of new European charm offensive.
But they both lacked a certain given history, that Merkel, that Putin was a spy serving the dictatorship under which Merkel suffered. I mean, he worked in Germany as a spy in Leipzig. Yeah. And I always, when I see them together on a press conference, there is this mystic tension between the two of them.
I think Merkel really got Putin, whereas I'm not so sure. But I'm not so sure with both Scholz and Laschet. So I'm.
Oh well, let's see.
Yeah. Let's have a look at this cartoon because I really liked it. Because it says that Merkel, to her own surprise and shock, nurtured or created an SPD chancellor. Did she?
Well,
in case Scholz wins,
we don't really know if she's in shock. I mean, she
doesn't look happy with it.
She ended up at the CDU, but that was more or less by accident. She was looking for which party. She wanted in the revolution. She decided to quit her job as a scientist and start in politics. And then she came with a small party that ended up being swallowed up by the CDU, and she was under the cover of Helmut Kohl. But
this whole story is told in your podcast.
Yes, please listen. But no, but it's. I make that point because we don't know what her real inner ideology is, and she's often called an SPD chancellor.
But she has certainly implemented many of the policy ideas and later got the credit for them. Like German, the decision to implement minimum wage is an SPD idea, and she got all the credit. And also gay marriage, for example. She was applauded when she gave that Harvard speech for all the achievements that weren't her achievements in the first place, but that she was pushed to do because of the Social Democrats.
There is a reason that German conservatives are a bit astray, and there's a reason that the AfD exists, and that has to do with Merkel being not a real conservative leader.
She hasn't been conservative enough to keep AfD out of the window.
I think so, yes.
Well, that she didn't want to. That was no longer possible. But indeed, within her party, she really went pretty far to the center, which is where she wants to be, in the Mitte. And so this is why Scholz is now capitalizing basically on having been her vice-chancellor. So he embodies continuity. I should just maybe want to add that she did have a different plan of succession at first, and the plan misfired because when she prepared the transition already 3 years ago with Annegret Kramp-Karrenbach, her defense minister, the party president, who she then made defense minister, but who wasn't good enough. So she had a plan A, it didn't work out. And then, well, the plan B was a little bit open. In the end, she swung behind Laschet, but never fully.
Can I make a footnote? Because
Yeah.
this, I mean, for the SPD for a long, long time thought that she was dying in Merkel's hands, not blossoming, because the SPD, if you look at the polls, was in free fall until basically August. So the SPD was campaigning around 15% for a long time in this election campaign. And that's the reason why the SPD will never ever enter a coalition with Merkel. I mean, it's not possible any longer, but with Merkel again, because they thought that Merkel was basically hugging them to death, getting all the praise for stuff that they brought into the coalition, and kind of and it's not the SPD that is blossoming right now. It's basically Olaf Scholz, who did not materialize, who did not manage to materialize kind of the support for him into support for his party. And this only happened at a very late point now. He was always more popular than his party, and that's still the case. But that was always the case for Merkel as well. She was.
When I saw this
Just the way
cartoon,
she was to the left of her party, he was to the right of his party. So
Yeah.
they're both in the
They're
center.
very
They
close.
position
Yeah.
themselves.
yeah, and I thought that maybe it's like a sort of a political historic cycle, which is doing justice to political history because Angela Merkel became so great because of Gerhard Schröder's structural reforms. When she took office, she could profit from all the structural reforms that he did. And so I thought, well, maybe after 16 years,
It's fair.
it's fair that the SPD now gets the gain. Finally, Luc, I wanted to know from you, what is the post-election scenario that you, with your European heart, what would you like best? What would be best for Europe? What scenario for Germany?
I think Ampel would be interesting for Europe.
Better than Jamaica.
Better than Jamaica, yes.
Why?
Well, it's good for a party to be in opposition from time to time, and it very rarely happens to the CDU. The CDU has played also a not so great role, we haven't talked about it, but in protecting some authoritarian leaders like Orban in their European offices, because, of course, the CDU has... and Merkel herself also, because she wanted the unity between Eastern and Western Europe, but she has been relatively kind, to put it mildly, for Orban and Kaczynski. So there, they would be maybe some stronger policies in that respect, and it would be a change. And I think, as I said before, in terms of character, I would bet more on Scholz than on Laschet, but of course the jury is out.
I wanted to have a look at our audience. Could we have a bit more light on the audience? Because I know there are people who know a lot about Germany, and maybe you have some questions or remarks or some nice ideas as well. The microphone is there. Jolien will come your way.
It's been a very interesting panel so far, I just wanted to say that. This question is for Lawrence, really, about something you said earlier about Merkel being the last of a sort of a generation that had a certain set of experiences. Would you say that there is something then, is there a lesson then missed by a new generation of European politicians, perhaps?
A lesson that is what?
Missed. Like, is there something that Merkel would have from her experience that you think is now going to be missing from the future?
Yeah, I think so. We don't know what was her position during the time, the last years of the GDR. She was apolitical. She was not involved in any protest, as far as we know. She doesn't talk about it, so we don't really know where she was. But it all happened literally on her doorstep. She lived in Prenzlauer Berg in the east of Berlin, the heart of the democratic opposition. And there was a famous night in East Berlin on the 7th of October 1989. That was the night that the state celebrated its 40th anniversary of socialism. And Gorbachev was in town. And this fueled a huge demonstration in East Berlin. And the people were screaming for help for Gorbachev. Well, demonstration in the city center, and they march into Prenzlauer Berg on the Schönhauser Allee to a church where all the protests meet. And there was an incredible amount of violence by the police, even for East German criteria. They beat the people up really badly. Lots of people were arrested. And why is this important for Merkel? Because Merkel lived there. It happened at her doorstep. Again, she doesn't talk about it. We don't know what kind of impression this made on her, but you can see it. So in the sidelines of her remarks, in the sidelines of her politics, you can see that she has a very sharp feeling for freedom and dictatorship and democracy. And I think that this era, the generation of politicians who lived through the division of Europe and who lived through the brutalness of dictatorship, they tend to have the feeling for the importance of freedom and liberalism. And in a time where the liberal democracy again is under pressure from right-wing populists all over Europe and in America, I think it's important to have politicians who have a personal feeling for the risks and the vulnerability of our democracy.
But if that is true, I don't really know how to reconcile that with what Luc was just saying, that Merkel and Germany have been so mild on Kaczynski and Orban.
Yeah, it annoys me as well.
But how do you explain for it? Because it's
well, because
EPP
of again
party membership.
Exactly, there are different aspects coming together in this problem. Because at the same time, it's impossible. Really impossible for a German leader to criticize a Polish leader. It's not possible. So they have to do it through sidelines. Then you see Mark Rutte saying, well, perhaps Hungary should leave the European Union. Of course that is in discussion with Merkel. He doesn't say anything like that on his own. So they have to make use of different... But the German leadership can't take such a role in Europe.
Okay.
I disagree wholeheartedly.
Okay.
I think that this leaves Germany off the hook much too easily. I think, for example, when it comes to the Christian Democratic Party and the CSU, even more so, and Viktor Orban, other forces are at play. It's the EPP party membership that, before Orban left just recently, was, I think, a strong factor. Majorities in Europe. And also business interests, and I think actually that was outrageous, and there was no reason to invite Viktor Orban to give speeches at Conservative Party conventions. I think nobody forced the CSU to invite Orban, and I think this is actually for me the biggest failure of the Merkel years. And also when it comes to the Peace Party, of course you're right with Poland. Very difficult relationship, very sensitive, full of history, and usually the Germans try to influence this debate via Brussels. But here I think it's also what we always praise with Merkel, kind of this bringing everybody to the table, making compromise with everybody. I think with the reform of the judiciary in Poland, she did not really take it seriously enough. I think she really... She tried to find a compromise until the very last moment, but I think there is a bigger responsibility at stake because this is undermining the fundamental principles of the European Union. And I think there would have been other means to speak up. And
okay, thank you. That's very clear. Somebody else a question or a remark? Here, Jolien in the front.
Hello, I think my question would be mainly for you, Jana. There has been some discussion about the role of climate change in this campaign, but the role of the floods has been remarkably small, I think, whereas this was the biggest disaster that hit Germany in a long time. The Greens didn't benefit from it. There's a lot of talk about Armin Laschet laughing, but what else happened, and why did it remain so local? Why isn't the rest of Germany? Why hasn't the rest of Germany been more involved in it?
So that's my personal theory, and I don't know if I'm right, but the whole climate topic has been dominating this election campaign. I completely agree with Luc. It was about personalities, but if there was one topic that politicians were forced to talk about, it was climate change in talk shows, in interviews. But the problem is that all three of the candidates tried to convene the message that they had a solution or that they had understood the problem. And so, whereas the Greens are, of course, the climate party, I think the SPD and the CDU tried to gain credibility. And this whole topic, I think, kind of everybody of the candidates brought this up all the time. So I think that to a certain extent, the Greens lost their unique selling point to the others because they managed to become somewhat credible, although I think they aren't that credible, actually. But the problem that we had in this election campaign was a lot about sacrifices. Even we had this famous round called Schlussrunde yesterday, where all 7 politicians were asked what their personal contribution against climate change was, kind of if they, I don't know, ride a bicycle instead of driving a car or something. And that was the level of the debate. And I think that was actually problematic because I think Germans understand that climate change is important, but somehow all the 3 candidates managed to tell the people we got it, we got you covered. But the SPD and the Greens at the same time say, but it doesn't cost you that much. And it's not with we don't have so many kind of rules and regulations as the Green Party wants you. So we have innovation and economic growth at the same time. And so I think this is how this topic was managed. Very few people understand the urgency that's behind climate change, I think. But that's my personal explanation.
Thank you, thank you. We are coming to the conclusion of this evening. We're not yet done yet, so please stay seated. I think I'm glad that it was not our goal to unravel the enigma that Angela Merkel is. I'm glad that we were talking about politics, because if it were our goal to get an idea of that enigma, what is behind it, we would have failed, I think. But I think we had a good discussion about what Germany might look like, what explained for Angela Merkel's enormous power and authority. And then we still had that wonderful opera that is waiting for us. First, I'd like to say thank you for watching at home, our online audience. Thank you for watching here in the Balie. Thank you, Jana Poulerin, Luc van Middelaar, and Laurens Boven for our discussion. And then finally, we have come and we will listen to a part from the Electro Opera Merkel, and that will be performed by singer and composer Annelena Baerbock. Annelena.
U dat, steen voor steen, hoort u dat de tijd kraakt? Hoort u daar, steen voor steen, de dag breekt aan, de mens is klaar, ontwaak, ontwaak, de wereld is af. Ontwaak, ontwaak, we nemen afscheid van het grote gebaar. De mist trekt op, zij aan zij. De markt gaat open, de mens is blij. Vrijheid voor iedereen, gelijkheid voor iedereen, broederschap voor iedereen. Geen strijd meer, geen haat, dit is het einde van de geschiedenis. Geen afgunst, geen kwaad, dit is het einde van de geschiedenis. dat? Hoort u daar? De laatste mens is hier.